Well, hello and welcome back to Read Becca. It's time, finally, for my 2024 favorite fiction reads. And this was a daunting list to make because I read so much last year, much of it very middling, but these are the tip top. These were fantastic books, and as a result of how much I read and how much I loved what I read, I have over 20 books to run through. So as I'm beginning to film this, I don't know if this will be a 1 or 2 part video. If it's taking all day, I will split this up. So let's get on to the books very quickly because of that. As I mentioned, over 20 books, and we're gonna rank them in no particular order. So I'm just gonna fly by the seat of my pants with these. The first book on the list is The Housekeeper and the Professor. This is such a quiet, charming novel set in contemporary Japan following a housekeeper who comes to work for a math professor. But he has some challenges in that he has no long-term memory. And so they're walking through a lot of the same steps in their day-to-day and repeating things. But this is such a beautiful novel about the connection they form in spite of those challenges, as well as the inherent value of a person. Next up is The Wall. And this is another quiet, introspective novel without a lot of action. We're following a single woman looking back through journal entries on her experience, beginning from a forest cabin alone when a wall comes down. An invisible wall blocks her off from the rest of society, and the things on the other side of the wall have clearly changed. And this is very much her day-to-day and learning to exist and survive in this new world for her. Her caring for animals that she comes upon. And it again tackles a lot of those themes of the inherent value of a person and the meaning of life when things have substantially changed, as well as our relationships with people. Then we have Arboreality. This was a Le Guin Prize winner, so I knew I had to check it out, and it's such a slim little volume that it took no time at all to read, but it was so impactful and well worth it. This little collection of vignettes set in a near future West Coast post-climate disaster is very different from what you would expect out of kind of an apocalyptic or cli-fi novel, in that it's kind of a mundane apocalypse. It's about how life goes on and finding hope and optimism, the ways that people move forward and find new normals, the way that community reforms and people retain and share knowledge. Next up is The Uncommon Reader. This is a perennial booktube favorite, as most bookish books are, so I was late to it, but it was well worth it and very much charmed me and warmed my heart. This book is following the Queen of England as she, late in life, discovers a love of reading and the ways that changes her as a person and how others' perception of her is affected by her becoming a reader. Another slight but impactful story on the list is Love and Saffron. Despite the title, it is not a romance. It's in fact a collection of letters back and forth between 2 women of different generations set in the 60s, and they're writing back and forth about their love of food. They're connecting over that. They live in different places and have different access to types of food, but in this pre-internet era, it wasn't easy to get access to international cuisine. And so that's the saffron of the title, is them acquiring this knowledge of the world and different types of cooking that they can do, different ingredients that are to them exotic and difficult to access, but they're finding ways to do that and delighting in that together over a distance. And it's just a book full of such heart and passion and connection between 2 very different women. An almost completely opposite dynamic between 2 women is Passing, where we have 2 women, both women of color, but one of them has been living her life passing as white. They've known each other since childhood, but are just re-encountering each other in adulthood and rebuilding a relationship that's very filled with jealousy and contention. This is such a suspenseful and almost thriller-esque story. It's quite short, so again, you can read it in a single sitting for the most part, and it's just very compulsive and has a lot to say. Next is The Woman in White. And I went into this with the complete wrong expectations, thinking it was somehow a gothic novel with maybe supernatural elements, and it is definitely neither of those things. It doesn't even allude to anything supernatural. It is much more a mystery and suspense novel. It's a very early version of that, and it's also in a mixed media format that is primarily following the investigation of a crime. And because of that, it is very compulsively unputdownable. So its length seems quite daunting. but this is some of the most compulsively readable classic work I've picked up recently, and was just a real standout there that I could see rereading, with definitely some new favorite characters. Then a novel that I've been perennially recommended, and am so thrilled to have finally gotten to, is Kindred. This certainly started my Octavia E. Butler reading journey, but I will definitely be continuing on with more from her because I adored the themes and execution of this novel, where she's following a young woman in the relatively recent past, continually getting pulled back in time to the slaveholding South. And as a woman of color, she is facing a great deal of threat there. So we're both witnessing and experiencing her floundering, trying to fit in and keep her head down to minimize the threat to herself until she can get back to her own time, and also trying to figure out why. Why is she here in this past time? Why is she continually getting pulled back in time? And the journey that it takes us on is very meaningful and very thought-provoking. Next, probably the book that I am the latest to the party on is Rebecca. And this really is a classic and a booktube favorite for a reason. It is truly impeccably written. The prose just is gorgeous and leaps off the page at you. It's also not at all what I expected. Much like The Woman in White, I for some reason went in thinking this was more of a gothic novel. And it does have the gothic manor house, kind of, but that's not really what it is prominently. I would say it's most a suspense novel. And even the main part at the beginning of the book is not set at the manor house. We're off in Monte Carlo on vacation. So this follows a woman who meets Maxime de Winter, the Lord of Manderley, and falls in love, marries him, and returning from their honeymoon, is facing this manor house that she's unequipped and unprepared to run as the mistress of the house. She's not very well socialized. She doesn't have social graces to deal with it. So she's forever in the shadow of the previous lady of the manor who is deceased. And that tension just builds and builds and builds. So it is a very suspenseful and tense novel, and absolutely a page turner. Next up, I have two books by the same author because I just couldn't cut one. So we're going for both because I enjoyed them both for very different reasons. The first is Abhorsen, which is kind of odd because it's the third book in a series, but really it's the second half from Lyriel. So Lyriel and Abhorsen together form a single story. And it is a real payoff to a truly epic quest journey, really. It's high epic fantasy with really big stakes, and things have just been building and building. But Nix always focuses so much on really wonderful characterization in addition to having his fantastic storytelling and world building. So much about this series has really blown me away, and as I said, I felt like this was just the perfect payoff to end this epic journey, and it really, really worked. And then we have kind of another smaller scale fantasy quest journey story, and that's Frogkisser, which is actually a kind of a middle grade story by Nix. And this one is tackling so many things about what traditional fantasy is doing and skewering them a little bit. It certainly is satirical, but it's also looking at what it's like to be the person who does the right and honorable thing, who seeks out justice just because you know that it needs doing, and not out of any sense of personal benefit. And it's just a really, really powerful book in a package that's fairly simple and quite hilarious. Probably one of the most surprising novels I read this year was Someone You Can Build a Nest In. Not in the least because it's just an enigma to describe the genre it fits in. It is sort of cozy and horror and fantasy and romance, all of the above. But we also have a main character who is a monster. And she's such an interesting character who's made up of biological material from body parts and stuff that she's consumed. But yet she's so empathetic and someone you can really connect with while also being othered and outside in this world. Fitting into kind of a medievally Eastern European setting, the leaders are very much out to get the monster and get the villagers behind hunting the monster and treating her as a curse. So when she stumbles upon a villager and makes a connection there, she begins questioning her understanding of the people. And Forming that connection leads her to question the nature of love in the first place. Her understanding of love is one that is kind of harmful, and she isn't sure that's what she wants for this person she cares for. Meanwhile, it's also bringing the reader to question the nature of what we consider good and evil, and if that is something that you can look at the surface level or pick sides. And I just really enjoyed the exploration throughout this novel. Next, another extreme genre blender is The Tainted Cup. And this has been on everyone's best of list, so I don't really need to talk about it, I'm sure, very much more, but I will because it is so, so good. This book blends together dark fantasy and mystery as kind of the main plot, as well as some feelings of Golden Age science fiction. We have some really rich characterization with a gender-swapped Sherlock and Watson dynamic with the two main characters, and the characterization throughout, not just the main characters, is so well developed. We also have this incredibly rich world building that gives us politics and hierarchy and class, while also engaging with the fantastical elements that everything in this world seems to be very strongly botanically influenced. The magic systems do. There's also the situation of a coastal Leviathan attack set up where engineering is very prominent and important, as well as military, because they're constantly beset by these problems. And it just is a really fully formed world. It feels so believable and realistic, while also being completely different from our own. Next, a more realist historical fantasy novel that I loved this year was Warm Hands of Ghosts. And this is such an immersive novel. I think I devoured this over a single weekend, and I just felt like I was there, present in the history, but it also has some really strong folkloric elements tied in. So we're following a brother and sister who are adults, and the woman is a nurse who was in the war but has returned home to Canada when she gets news that her brother has died on the front. But she has reasons to doubt that. So she, along with the help of some friends, sets things in motion to find out if that is true and uncover the real situation for him. And this just felt so atmospheric and really puts you in the place, while also exploring a lot about the experiences and the true bleakness of this situation day to day for the people existing through it. An author that I always love and seems to show up on my best of list basically every year is T. Kingfisher, so this year couldn't be an exception. And as a result, I have The Hollow Places, which is the last of her horror novels that were out at the time for me to get to, but she's so prolific that I rather expect there will be a new one anytime now. So this novel brings together so many elements of what I love about her work in general, while also, and this is often the case with T. Kingfisher's work, drawing from a classic work. So this is inspired by primarily The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. And she has taken that and made it her own by setting us in a contemporary setting with a woman who has sort of lost her way and is facing not really having a place to go when her uncle reaches out and gives her a place at his curiosity shop, more or less. And she finds a portal to another world there that is very eerie. And so we're drawing from The Willows there, very spooky and creepy. And we also have certain elements that harken back to The Magician's Nephew from the Chronicles of Narnia as well. And it's somewhat referential in the book too. And I love that. That's my favorite Narnia book. So all of that culminated in this just being probably my favorite of her horror works. And I just adored it. It's going to stick with me, and I could totally see rereading this, in fact. I also affirmed an author I will be returning to with everything they put out, much like T. Kingfisher, in Chuck Tingle. And I definitely did not have Chuck Tingle becoming a favorite author on my bingo card for the year, but that's what happened. The prior year had read and loved Camp Damascus, and in 2024, reading Bury Your Gaze, it just is such a stellar, thoughtful, and complex novel, while also being really fun and entertaining. This one is much more graphic and horror-y, I would say, than Camp Damascus was, but it's doing so many things in commentary on both the gay experience, Hollywood, AI, and technology. It's kind of a Black Mirror episode in a novel, and it really is that same style of science fiction horror that involves heavy social commentary and really hits the reader hard. So I just love this. I think for my liking, Camp Damascus was much more personal and hit me much more. So that one is probably my favorite. But I think this is the better novel, and I just can't wait to see what Chuck Tingle does next. And he does have a new novel coming out this year, I believe. So I will really, really be amped up to get to it. All right, we're nearly there. I have 2 books from the same series, so I'm going to kind of combine those as my favorite thrillers of the year, and that's Dark Saturday and Day of the Dead from the Frida Klein series. So I've read and loved this series, but it is very, very uneven. And I read 4 of the 8 books in the series in 2024. And so of those 4, 2 of them were really, really standouts. Dark Saturday is almost entirely focused on a case and uncovering the mystery of this woman who has been locked away in an asylum since she was a teenager. And Frida Klein, the main character of this series, is a psychotherapist who frequently steps in and helps the police with cases. But this is kind of a cold case, so it's not really clear for a lot of this book why she's been pulled to get involved in this, because everyone seems to believe that this woman in the asylum killed her entire family and then went silent and stopped speaking. And so she hasn't really talked about the situation in years, and Frida is trying to make a connection with her. And it is a very thrilling and suspenseful story. And I think this one was extremely easy to read and really kept me gripped start to finish. The other story, Day of the Dead, is the finale to the entire series. And it also has a great single book plot. It starts out with almost no Frida and new mysteries, new crimes popping up. And so that part initially, right from the beginning, completely pulled me in and was so curious. We have this situation of a runaway car plowing into a storefront and not knowing what's gone on through the eyes of someone who's witnessing it happening. And then we're unraveling the threads from that to our connection to Frida. And all of this is culminating through a massive story arc that has been playing out over the entire series. So we are both getting a very satisfying kind of single story mystery and a really satisfying, I think, payoff to the series. So it just really was a great end to the books. Though Frida, for me, is not always the most likable character, she is complex, and I loved seeing her growth as a person over the series to where she is in this last book. Finally winding down, let's wrap up with my several spooky house novels. I definitely went into that vibe at the end of the year last year and discovered several books that are kind of in this trope that I really, really enjoyed. So the first of those is The Little Stranger. This is kind of an outlier, I think, for Sarah Waters' work, but I really loved it. I think this had a lot to say in exploring, both directly and indirectly, the changing of society in historical England post-war, still during rationing times as people are struggling, and the difference and change in classes at that time. As we're following a doctor, a country doctor, who is constantly traveling around, and he's helping out the family who live in this manor house. And they're struggling to get by, struggling to upkeep the house. Meanwhile, increasingly strange things are happening there. And so it is kind of an allegory for the changing times and the breakdown in this world order of the time. And the next spooky house story is The 13th Tale. And this is a mix between contemporary and historical. So in the contemporary timeline, we're following a young woman who has been requested to come meet this very reclusive author who is very secretive about her past and is known to lie, in fact. And so this woman has been requested to come write her biography and doesn't know what to believe or trust. But the author says she is finally willing to open up and tell the true story as she's aging and facing the end of her life. And then in the past, we're looking at her backstory as she tells this really incredible sweeping story that involves a very isolated manor house, a family that are outcasts and unusual in their community, and a lot of interpersonal dramas there within the manor house. And it's really incredible and is another one that really sweeps you along and pulls you into the sense of place there at this manor house. And it's very eerie and spooky while also being quite grounded. And in the end, I felt very hopeful. A more contemporary spooky house novel that I read this year and loved is Craven Manor. And this had so much heart to it, oddly, that was what really made me connect with it so much. So we're following a man who is down on his luck. He's facing joblessness, and he's been homeless before, so he recognizes that that's just one wrong step away from going back there. And oddly, an invitation shows up, a job offer shows up without him even having applied, for him to become a groundskeeper at this strange manor house that he's never seen before. And so it seems a little too good to be true, but he doesn't feel like he has other options. So he shows up there and takes the job, but never seems to meet the person who invited him to come. But he's got instructions continuing to show up, and as long as the paychecks keep coming, it's good for him. But it also verges into the paranormal and supernatural, and yet it is full of empathy for people and connection throughout. So I think that's what I loved, that it almost feels like cozy horror. As well, it's really introspecting and questioning the ideas of storytelling, and that the people in power have the power to dictate the story that everyone else hears. And I think there was just a lot to that. There were many layers to this, while also being incredibly readable. And lastly, but not leastly, certainly, is Slade House. This starts my journey into David Mitchell's work, and I'm so glad to have finally gotten to it, because I've been recommended this so many times, and I will absolutely be continuing on with more of his work in this year, because this blew me away. It is so short, and it's broken up into kind of vignettes, each chapter taking place 9 years apart. They're relatively contemporary. I want to say the earliest chapter starts in the 1970s. And so we're jumping through time, following a different character in each chapter as they encounter the Slade House, this strange manor house in England that doesn't always seem to be quite there. And so we're following these different characters as they see this manor house, they see and interact with the manor house, the backstory of the inhabitants of this manor house, and what it means for them. And it's very speculative, definitely, but also feels very grounded. It feels really tangible and real, and yet it's completely unreal. And many elements, as we're looking at the backstories of the people who live there, feel historical, and they also feel like they incorporate a historical version of the supernatural that may have been believable of the time. I just love it, and I can't wait to get to some of his more long-form work to see how he expands on this, because it just really blew me away. From the short chapters having such great characterization, really fleshed out each character as we get a new perspective, while also layering in these different aspects of threat and tension, and this eerie house setting that just is such a place you want to go visit, even though it's a little bit spooky. So with that, I think we have successfully rounded out my final best of video from 2024. It was such a stellar reading year. I have really had an awful lot of standout books, so it was extremely difficult to narrow it down. But I think we've done it, and this is a success. So I hope that you were able to discover some new books that you might want to pick up from this list, because I would pretty much wholeheartedly shove these in your hands if I could. But these are my recommendations from my last year's reads that you should definitely do your best to get to if you have not given them a try already. So with that, I implore you to let me know what your favorite fiction read was last year, if you could narrow it down. And I will say thank you so very much for watching.